beautiful city in America was built to be destroyed, and barely a year after 27 million people walked its marble-white streets, almost every building was gone. Chicago's 1893 World's Fair rose across 630 acres as 200 palaces, canals, and 200,000 electric lights, a gleaming white city. But its glory was a trick. Those palaces weren't stone at all. So what were they really made of, and why did the men who built them let it burn? The answer starts with the walls. Run your hand along one of those gleaming columns, and it would not feel like marble. It would feel like plaster, exactly what it was. The material had a plain, industrial name, staff. Plaster of Paris mixed with cement and loose jute fiber, poured into molds, and hung on a skeleton of wood and iron, like skin on a frame. Crews sprayed the whole thing white. From a distance, it read as solid stone. Up close, a costume. The recipe was roughly 3 parts plaster of Paris to 1 part cement, bulked with hemp or jute to keep it from cracking. Workers in on-site shops cast it in reusable molds, some panels running 20 feet long, then bolted the hardened pieces onto the timber and iron frames. A single ornamental capital could be duplicated 100 times from 1 mold, which is how a crew of a few thousand clad 200 buildings in under 2 years. That costume was the vision of one man. Daniel Burnham, director of works, held the entire fantasy together, and his title belonged to something grander than a fairground, the world's Columbian Exposition, a national statement dressed up as a party. Burnham was 46 when the work began, and he ran the site like a general, at peak, commanding a labor force of around 40,000 men. He answered to a corporation that had sold $5 million in stock to Chicago citizens, and to a construction budget that swelled past $28 million before the gates opened. And a national statement needs a reason. The fair marked the 400th anniversary of Columbus reaching the New World in 1492. America wanted to plant a flag on the calendar and do it loudly. Congress had awarded the fair to Chicago in 1890, only after a bruising fight with New York, Washington, and St. Louis, and the city won partly by promising to raise the money itself. The dedication ceremonies were staged on the 21st of October, 1892, exactly 4 centuries after the landing, though the grounds were nowhere near finished. The public would not be let in for another 6 months. There was also a wound to answer. 4 years earlier, Paris had opened its 1889 Exposition and stunned the world with the Eiffel Tower. Chicago felt the sting. It did not just want to host a fair, it wanted to beat France. The Eiffel Tower had drawn some 32 million visitors and made every rival nation feel provincial. But wanting to beat France and affording it were different things. Chicago had roughly 2 years and a budget with hard edges. Permanent palaces of quarried stone in that window were impossible. So the planners made a bargain that decided everything. They traded permanence for spectacle. Spectacle they could deliver, and the man shaping the ground beneath the buildings was a genius in his own right. Frederick Law Olmsted, the mind behind Central Park, designed the landscape of lagoons and wooded islands that made the White City feel less like an exhibition than a dream you could row a boat through. Olmsted worked alongside his young partner Henry Codman, who grasped the Jackson Park scheme so completely that his sudden death in 1893 was a quiet catastrophe for the design team. Together they had turned a swampy, wind-scoured stretch of lakefront into a system of lagoons fed from Lake Michigan, planting the wooded island at its center as a green refuge amid the marble. That dream came at a human cost few visitors knew. John Root, Burnham's brilliant partner, died before construction was finished. The fair's most poetic imagination was gone early, and the surviving team pushed forward without him, on plaster and nerve. Root died on the 15th of January, 1891 of pneumonia, only weeks after the architects had agreed to make the whole fair a uniform neoclassical white. He had favored warmth and color. Some believe the ghostly monochrome of the finished city was, in part, an accident of his absence. With the deadline closing in, the builders reached for scale as their weapon. If the palaces could not be permanent, they could be enormous. And one became the largest building on Earth. They called it the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building, and its numbers still sound invented. It stretched about 687 feet end to end, and enclosed roughly 44 acres of open floor, a space so vast that clouds were said to form near the ceiling. George B. Post designed it, and its central hall was spanned by arched steel trusses that leapt 368 feet without a supporting column, the widest clear span ever built at that point. The roof stood 245 feet overhead, and the whole shed could seat something like 300,000 people at once. Here is the detail that should stop you. This record-breaking colossus, the largest building in the world, was built the same cheap way as everything else. The same staff, the same plaster shell over the same wood and iron bones. The biggest building humanity had ever raised was, at heart, temporary. If the scale was an illusion of stone, the fair sold a second illusion that turned out entirely real, the future itself wired and glowing. And that future rode on a genuine gamble. The question of the age was how to move electricity across distance. Westinghouse won the contract to light the fair, using the alternating current system championed by Nikola Tesla. A live scientific war, and the White City became its battlefield and billboard. Westinghouse had won the lighting contract with a bid of about $399,000, undercutting General Electric and Thomas Edison by more than $150,000. Because Edison controlled the patents on the ordinary light bulb, Westinghouse had to invent his own stopper, lamp, and manufacture 250,000 of them in a single year to fulfill the order. The result at nightfall was something almost no visitor had witnessed. Roughly 200,000 incandescent bulbs traced every roofline and reflected off every lagoon. People who had grown up by candle and gas flame stood in the electric glow and wept. The future did not arrive gradually here, it switched on. The fair drew roughly 3 times as much electricity as the entire surrounding city of Chicago, its dynamos housed in a machinery hall that hummed like a cathedral of engines. For millions of visitors from farms and small towns, this was the first electric light they had ever seen, and newspapers reported people reaching out to touch the bulbs to see if they were warm. And rising above that sea of light stood the machine everyone came to see. The first Ferris wheel turned slowly against the sky and answered to Paris and its tower. It lifted riders 264 feet into the air, higher than any building for miles. Its inventor had a name as grand as the thing itself. George Washington Gale Ferris, Jr. built it to prove America could astonish with steel, just as France had. 2,000 people at a time rode his wheel, looking down on a city that would not exist much longer. Ferris built it in Pittsburgh and had it shipped to Chicago in pieces, at a cost of around $400,000. Its axle was a 45-ton shaft of forged steel, the largest single piece of steel ever made to that date. 36 cars, each the size of a bus, carried 60 passengers apiece. A full revolution took about 20 minutes and cost 50 cents, the same as admission to the entire fair. For 6 months, that impossible city belonged to everyone, the most visited place in the entire nation, before anyone had to reckon with what came next. Inside its halls, ordinary Americans tasted their first Cracker Jack and juicy fruit gum, met the newly branded Aunt Jemima and cream of wheat, and watched machines spin the first shredded wheat and stamp out the earliest zippers. A young candy maker named Milton Hershey wandered the exhibits, saw German chocolate-making equipment for sale, and bought the whole line on the spot, the seed of an empire. The season ran from the 1st of May to the 30th of October, 1893. When the gates closed, the count was staggering. Roughly 27 million admissions in a country whose whole population was only about 63 million. Nearly half of America passed through the turnstiles. Of those, about 21.5 million were paying customers. and on a single day, the 9th of October, 1893, christened Chicago Day to mark the anniversary of the Great Fire. More than 715,000 people crowded through the gates, a record for any gathering on Earth to that time. They spread across a vast site. About 630 acres of Jackson Park had been remade into canals, courts, and pavilions. Some 200 buildings stood on that ground, and almost everyone was living on borrowed time. Running west from the formal courts stretched the Midway Plaisance, a mile-long avenue of amusements that gave the English language the word Midway. It held the Ferris wheel, a recreated Cairo street with dancers, a Bavarian village, and a captive balloon, and it was here, not in the solemn court of honor, that most visitors actually spent their money. Borrowed time, because outside the painted gates, the country the fair was built to celebrate had begun to come apart. While visitors admired the palaces, the economy beneath them was collapsing. It has a name, the Panic of 1893. A financial shock spread into a deep national depression, one of the worst ever seen. Banks folded. Railroads went bankrupt across the map. The confidence that had raised the White City drained away in a single terrible year. The panic had begun that February with the collapse of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, and by year's end, some 500 banks and 15,000 businesses had failed. Unemployment climbed toward 20% in parts of the country, and within months, armies of the jobless would march on Washington, even as the fair's lights still burned. That collapse decided the fate of the Plaster City as surely as any fire. The Exposition Corporation ended the season buried in debt. There had always been a faint hope of converting the grandest buildings into permanent stone landmarks. Now there was no money to do it. The dream was insolvent. And into that gloom came a blow that felt almost scripted, turning the closing days from triumph to mourning. Days before the final bell, the fair's own city lost its leader to an assassin. Carter Harrison Sr., the mayor of Chicago, was shot dead in his home on the 28th of October, 1893. His killer was Patrick Prendergast, an unstable office seeker who believed he was owed a government post and denied it. The most public celebration in America suddenly had blood at its center. Harrison, serving his 5th term as mayor, had spent that very afternoon addressing visiting mayors at the fair, boasting of the city's boundless future. Prendergast shot him at his own front door that evening. The young lawyer Clarence Darrow later took up the killer's appeal on a plea of insanity, but failed, and Prendergast was hanged the following summer. The city could not throw a party over a fresh grave. The grand closing festivities were canceled and replaced with a somber memorial. The fair that had opened to fireworks closed to a funeral hush 2 days later, on the 30th of October. With the crowds gone and the money gone, the White City stood empty in the cold, and the plaster that had fooled 27 million eyes began almost immediately to fail. The dyeing started that very winter, in flames. On the 8th of January, 1894, fire tore through the grounds and destroyed the peristyle, the colonnade that framed the lakefront. The casino and the music hall went with it. The dry staff shells did not resist the fire. They fed it, burning like tinder, waiting for a match. By then the decay was visible to anyone who looked. Months after closing, the untended palaces were cracking and sagging, their white skin peeling in the weather. What had looked eternal in the summer light now looked like exactly what it was, abandoned scenery. But the winter fire was only a rehearsal. The true erasure came the following summer. No accident of a cold, empty building, but set on purpose, born of a war between labor and capital. On the 5th of July, 1894, massive fires swept the heart of the fairgrounds. They rose amid the fury of the Pullman strike, a violent railroad conflict that had turned Chicago into a tinderbox of soldiers and strikers. In that chaos, someone put the White City to the torch. The strike had grown out of the Pullman company town just south of the fairgrounds, where George Pullman had slashed wages but refused to lower rents. Eugene Debs's American Railway Union answered with a boycott that paralyzed rail traffic across the country. President Cleveland ordered federal troops into Chicago in early July, and in the smoke and lawlessness of those days, the emptied Exposition made an easy target. The flames took the very core of the vision, the administration building with its gilded dome, the record-breaking manufacturers building, the mines building beside it, the Grand Court of Honor, the postcard image of the whole fair, all burned in a single spectacular night. Richard Morris Hunt had designed that administration building and crowned it with the gilded dome. The Court of Honor had gathered the greatest architects and sculptors of the age, from Charles McKim to Augustus St. Gaudens, who called it the finest meeting of artistic minds since the 15th century. In a single July night, most of their shared masterpiece became ash, and people came to watch it go. Crowds gathered along the lakefront as the palaces they had marveled at a year before dissolved into orange light and falling ash. The most beautiful city in America ended as a bonfire, applauded by the very public that had loved it. Yet, out of all that ruin, one building refused to die, and its survival was not luck. It was the single exception written into the plan from the start, the one structure judged too important to trust to plaster. That building was the Palace of Fine Arts. Because it would hold priceless paintings and sculptures loaned from around the world, its planners gave it real brick masonry walls beneath the decorative shell, built to be fireproof, so the treasures inside could never share the fate everyone quietly expected for the rest. Charles B. Atwood designed it in a severe Greek revival style, its colonnades modeled on the Erechtheum in Athens. After the fair, it sheltered the new Field Columbian Museum, home to the natural history collections, until they moved out in 1920 and left the building to decay in earnest. So it alone outlasted the fair. When the flames and the wrecking crews had finished with everything else, the Palace of Fine Arts still stood. Decades later, it was rebuilt in permanent stone around that same fireproof core, and survives today as the Museum of Science and Industry, the last living fragment of the White City. The buildings vanished, but the idea inside them proved almost impossible to burn. What the fair really exported was not architecture, it was a vision of what an American city could be. That vision became a movement. Planners called it City Beautiful, and it swept the country. Grand boulevards, classical civic centers, order imposed on the industrial chaos of the age. Burnham carried it forward into his 1909 plan of Chicago, a blueprint drawn straight from the memory of the fair. Burnham would go on to replan Cleveland, San Francisco, and even Manila, leaving behind the challenge historians still quote, "Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood." His 1909 plan of Chicago gave the city its unbroken lakefront parks and the widening of Michigan Avenue, all traceable to the discipline of the White City. Its reach went all the way to the Capitol. The ideas rehearsed in Jackson Park shaped the redesign of Washington, District of Columbia, its monumental core and open mall. From there, the neoclassical dream spread to courthouses and city halls in towns that had never sent a single visitor to Chicago. In 1901, a Senate commission led by Burnham and stocked with fair veterans. The architect Charles McKim, the sculptor St. Gaudens, and Olmsted's own son, redrew Washington's mall along the fair's clean axial lines. The White City had become a template for how a republic ought to look, which returns us to the uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. The demolition of the White City was never a failure, and never truly an accident. It was the design. The staff that clad those palaces had a lifespan of only a few years, and everyone building it knew that. Permanent stone would have cost far more than the fair could ever earn back, especially once the panic emptied the treasury. Most of what survived the fires was cleared away, and by 1896 the grounds were nearly bare. The spectacle survives now almost entirely in photographs. Built to dazzle, then disappear. That was the bargain from first day to last. Chicago never meant to keep the White City. It meant to burn its image into the mind of a nation, then let the plaster go. In that, it succeeded more completely than stone ever could. If you enjoyed walking these vanished streets with us, consider subscribing so we can keep bringing lost worlds back to life.